In this video, we're going to discuss the different approaches to the control of carbon dioxide emissions. Of course, that's important because the more we emit, the more global warming we get. So let's start first with conservation. I'm going to gloss over behavior change a little bit, not because it's not the most important thing possible, but because we have another video in this series about your personal carbon footprint. And when you learn your carbon footprint, you learn what behaviors you are doing that contribute to climate change, and therefore you have, I would argue, a moral obligation to change them. So that is simplified here, reducing and changing how you do things. More than what was just listed there, but again, check out that video if you want to learn more. Efficiency is a big one. Appliances that use less energy. Most countries now, when you go to buy something like a refrigerator or a microwave, it has a sticker on it that tells you how efficient it is. You should always choose the most efficient appliance there is, even if it is slightly more expensive, because studies show it does save you money and energy on the long run, and when we save energy, we also reduce carbon dioxide emissions. The other thing is the use of insulation. A lot of energy is wasted because it's lost to the outside. So when we're trying to cool a room and we allow heat to come in without the use of proper insulation, or in colder climates we are heating the inside and then the heat is transferring to the cold outside. Again, insulation will be increasing the efficiency of conserving energy when you're cooling or heating. Singapore is actually one of the leading countries in raising the standards of insulation, and especially in trying to make sure that buildings undergoing renovations undergo new standards when they are approved. The second thing we want to look at is reduce of carbon intensive fuels. And so there's something really amazing going on right now. And that is that August 2013, the data came back, and what we see here is the world electricity production, and you can see here coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear, renewables, and other. So if we follow this, we can see coal has and continues to be the mainstay of electricity production, and then we can see here this green line here, renewables. You can see that just in 2013, renewables surpassed this other green one being natural gas. So the significance of this is the first time in history that renewables became the second leading energy source globally. That's fantastic news, because that means we are reducing carbon intensive fuels by the use of alternative energies. Another way that we can do this is by using carbon neutral fuels. So these are fuels that do produce carbon, but it doesn't actually contribute to climate change because it doesn't actually increase the amount of CO2 in the air. Well, how does that work? Well, let's take a tree. While a tree was growing, it underwent photosynthesis, which meant it took in CO2 from the air. When we cut it down and burn it, it re-releases that CO2 it had absorbed before. That CO2 goes back in the air, but then it is reabsorbed by the plant that is growing where we had cut that tree down. So you can see it's a cycle, and therefore there is no net increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we call that carbon neutral. The last way we can do that is by using lower carbon fuels, and this is sort of the last resort in a lot of ways. And what you can see here is, for example, let's cut off a little bit. Let me bring that down for you. The carbon content of fuels. So this tells you how much carbon there is per energy unit. So you can see here there's a lot more carbon in coal and fuel than there is in methane gas. So some countries are choosing to transition their power away from these more carbon intensive fossil fuels to slightly less. Now it's still a fossil fuel, it still contributes to climate change, but if you have to choose between these three, this is the best one, and that is another example of Singapore being one of the few countries that led an early transition away from these other fossil fuels, and most of our energy comes from natural gas. It still contributes to climate change though, so we need to eventually get off it. The third way is carbon capture, and this is one that's been getting a lot of press, but it's also very misleading. So the first one, carbon capture, plants store carbon. That's like what we just saw. when we start planting, if we start reforesting and actually returning a lot of the land to be rehabilitated to plant life that will actually absorb carbon from the air, we'll be very, very well on our way to reducing carbon dioxide in the air. The second one is more technology, capturing CO2 from the exhaust. Now, when we talk about that, we usually mean on the industrial scale, so like our generating stations. So normally what would happen is this smokestack would just release the CO2 directly into the atmosphere, causing climate change. What they are experimenting with now, and we can do it, is we can take the CO2, funnel it through this capture system, and that capture system will actually then bury the CO2 deep underground so that it's underground, therefore not in the air, therefore not actually contributing to climate change. So what it shoots out is what will not cause climate change, but it may cause other environmental damage. It could be particulates, pollution, etc. So the idea there is that this one here in theory works, but when we actually look at the applications of it, it's actually incredibly expensive to the point that really nobody adopts it. It hasn't really been adopted even though it exists. So we would need probably some government to step in and make that mandatory